This is Talk.
Welcome back, Alex Phillips, sitting in for the wonderful Julia Hartley-Brewer, who is cooling her heels somewhere aboard and no doubt having a sort of, pre-noon cocktails. Whatever you're doing, Julia, cheers, enjoy yourself, put your feet up. It was a tough election campaign and you deserve the break. Right, now, let's go back to domestic politics. It is, of course, the King's speech on Wednesday, where Sir Keir Starmer will lay out the agenda of his new government, and we'll start to get a glimpse of the programme of policy that he wants to impose on the country. And among it, I'm pleased to say, there are some good ideas. He wants to target shoplifters and knife crime. Talking about that just before the break. Well, that's much needed. Something else which is much needed, which the past government brought in, but is going to stick around, apparently, is the ban on puberty blockers. Health Secretary Wes Streeting has insisted that that ban is here to stay. Now, why this is important is because the Labour Party, by and large, were pulling themselves apart over this issue. In fact, very few people in the Labour Party seem to have the guts or the spine to stand up for common sense and stand up for science. I remember the extreme bullying suffered by Rosie Duffield when she talked about harms being perpetrated against children with this sort of crazy new scientific experiment of gender dysphoria being somehow a medical problem that you can use medical intervention to treat. There was one clinic, of course, that became infamous during this process, and that is the Tavistock GIDS service in London. And there were people who worked at that clinic who were equally quite concerned about the direction of travel and what some might call the more experimental approach being used, where young kids who might have been bombarded with stuff on social media or think it's trendy to question their gender, who might have neurodivergencies such as Asperger's or autism, were going to this clinic to seek advice and immediately being started on a medical pathway, which in many respects is completely irreversible. And some brave souls had the tenacity to blow the whistle. I want to speak to one of those brave souls now, and I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Susan Evans, who's a former clinical nurse at Tavistock, who really did raise this issue. Susan, I mean, it's mad that we got to the stage that people like you had to sort of play the part of whistleblower and were somehow against the tide when it comes to this medical experiment. And back then, the Labour Party were too scared to say anything about it. It must come as a great relief to you to hear that Wes Streeting is now turning around and saying, great, this puberty blocker ban will stay in place. I mean, thank goodness for the Cass report and science coming back into the room that we can now have an adult conversation about it and prevent essentially the medical abuse of an unknown number of children.
Yes, hello Alex, thanks for inviting me on. Yes, I'm really pleased that Wes Streeting and the Labour Party have decided to follow the careful research and advice of Dr. Hilary Cass and her team, because they have been the first in this country, certainly the first organisation appointed to thoroughly examine the evidence. And the truth of it is, Alex, that when I first raised this issue, to me it wasn't even a political issue. Back in 2004, my experience was about mental health work, and to me it was just very serious clinical concerns I had about taking children too quickly to a medical approach, when to me it felt very obvious that there were sort of psychological developmental issues that should be addressed initially, and that medicalisation is something that certainly shouldn't interfere with adolescence and childhood development.
I mean, what sort of things did you see? I mean, how many kids do you think have basically been put on a medical pathway for what, by and large, is a psychological condition? I mean, no one's born in the wrong body. They just have the sense that they are, if they have genuine gender dysphoria. How many young people do you think have been irrevocably damaged by medical intervention? And do you see in the future some of these young people, when they grow up, essentially suing the government, suing the NHS, suing people who enabled this to happen?
It's difficult to give you any exact answers because, of course, the Tavistock GIDS service were not very good at keeping records, as we found out during the judicial review with Keira Bell. But certainly my understanding and my personal experience of talking with people and talking with clinicians in this area is that there is now a growing number of detransitioners or people who've desisted from the idea that medicalisation is the answer to their difficulties or the things they were trying to understand about themselves. So I think it's difficult. I mean, we know, I think, that there were approximately 1,000 children at the Tavistock who had the treatment. Don't quote me on it, but I think it's around that. But of course, this is one of the problems. Everywhere you look, you might find a different statistic. I think the important thing to say, though, is that there are definitely thousands of children who have now really been fed these messages through schools, through social media, through institutions and organisations. And I think that's the most worrying thing to address now, because previously children perhaps were confused and perhaps distressed and struggling in their teen years, but they were helped to get through it in various ways. The problem is now the message is, if you feel you're not right, this is your answer. And I think that that's a very dangerous one to give developing kids. It's quite contagious.
Yeah, not just that. I think it goes even further than that, and it actually becomes trendy. I think a lot of young people think that they have a sort of degree of being more special or more celebrated or more important if they go down this route, or say they're going down this route, and young girls especially. Am I right in saying that actually back, when records really began on people with gender dysphoria, it's largely a male condition? About 75% of people would normally be men presenting with genuine gender dysphoria. But a vast number of girls were the people coming into Tavistock Clinic, and that girls sort of have a tendency towards this sort of mass hysteria where they all want to fit in part of a pack, and the sexualisation, the hypersexualisation now of women, be it the Kardashians or the sort of pop stars they're looking at, Snapchat, they're sort of forced into this adult world so much sooner, and all of these things together are making girls think life would be easier being a boy, and that a lot of these girls are ending up being told, well, yeah, that's great, you can do that if you like, go and have a mastectomy.
The thing is with mental health, it's important to say that most mental health conditions are a state of mind. In other words, they're transient, they move. Now, of course, there are a few that one might argue are permanent, but that's the important thing to say about mental health work. And of course, there is this contagious element, you're right. And certainly my experience is that parents who contacted me about their children have said there was nobody in the class, then there was one, and now there are 10. So I think we've got to acknowledge that there is that element to it, that it's catching or that it's trendy. But the other thing is that a lot of the kids that I've seen over the years have been kids who are struggling with their identity. They don't like themselves. In fact, I go as far as to say some of them either hate themselves or they feel they just don't fit in anywhere. And of course, that needs help of a psychological nature. And I think to be sold this idea that if you take medication that interfere with your natural body, or that you start to have surgeries, and we know that the surgical outcomes are not good for many of these surgeries, that's a really bad message to be giving our youth.
Yeah,
and I really want to see that change.
I completely agree with you. It's hard enough being a teenager as it is, let alone a teenager in the 21st century with all the pressures of social media. Susan Evans, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. You know what? When I look at this idea of a medical intervention for a psychological condition, I ask myself, what is different between this weird abusive experiment that has happened to thousands of children now at clinics such as Tavistock? What is different to that and what the Victorians used to do in their old asylums when they gave people electroshock therapy for depression or lobotomised people? It's just, it's ridiculous. I think in years to come, we're going to look back on this as a very dark day in Britain's medical history. Taking a short break now, but when I come back, the floor is yours. Charlie and I want to take your calls and hear